All right, welcome everybody. I'm Sean Crosland. I'm the director of the Thane Center for Student Life Leadership and Community Engagement at Salt Lake Community College. I'm joined with two of our amazing political science faculty who are going to talk to us a little bit about election security and integrity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Colin Moore, and I'm going to be speaking about security and integrity issues with the election in 2020, pre-election stuff, and then leading up to election day.
And I am Perparim Gutaj, and I'm also a professor of political science, and I will focus on post-election integrity.
All right, so I'm going to be going first. So I'm going to share my screen, everyone, so just give me one moment and put up a quick PowerPoint. And to start us off, we have what is clearly on everyone's mind coming tomorrow, election 2020, American flag and background. That sets it up. And we're going to first speak to who runs the election show. First, we have to speak of federalism very briefly. It's the idea in the Constitution, there's a division of power between the federal government and the states. And each level, therefore, has powers and responsibilities that may differ, but sometimes they overlap. And then drilling down into election control, it's very decentralized, as much in the United States is, where states generally make up policy about the elections in their own states. Even if it's a federal election, you can have different rules in different states. The local governments usually implement these state policies. Now, state officials may or may not be on the ground at these local sites. So it's implemented at the local level by local governments. States and local governments provide funding for the elections. The federal government does have a role. It can conduct oversight of state and local practices. And some of the categories I have on the slide here: campaign finance, election administration, election security, redistricting, contested elections, and voting rights. They're looking for, sometimes they are looking for fraud. Sometimes they're looking for malpractice at the state level by officials. They're looking for constitutional rights being violated and things like that. Okay, so they do have a role, but it's mainly a state and local show. Okay, now we're speaking about election integrity, therefore fraud is the question. Is it common? The answer is, in short, it's no, it's not. It's quite rare. I have 3 studies up here that I'm going to say very briefly. The first, Brennan Center for Justice, which is out of New York University, did a study and they found incident rates very, very low. As you can see by the percentages there, it's 0.00003% and a little bit over that of reported incidents. And even among those, after investigations were done, some of these were even just found to be clerical errors or bad data matching practices. So very little. Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, has a database of election fraud cases in the United States. Over the past 20 years, only about 1,200 cases of vote fraud of all kinds were found, 1,100 convictions. But we have to remember, this is out of hundreds of millions of ballots being cast, hundreds of millions. And then Arizona State University, they found from 2000 to 2012, 10 cases of voter impersonation fraud nationwide. So very, very little. So, but it is a concern. It doesn't mean there's not questions about keeping the machines intact and worrying about what people do, but the instances of it are quite low. But there are security measures that do exist. So what happens before an election? States test and certify voting machines. Between elections, they store them in safe places to make sure no one tampers with them in between. They have contingency plans in an emergency situation. If the machines go bad, what's going to happen? Are they going to replace it with paper ballots or whatever? So there are plans in case they don't work, the technology fails. And also, before the election, there are training of poll workers, election officials, and IT staff to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible. And during an election, now, when I say during an election, that doesn't only mean election day. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of early voting going on. So it starts before, but when people start to vote, there's something called chain of custody requirements, which makes people basically write down and record when they deal with any machines or ballots. So person X has to say, from this point to this point, I was dealing with the ballots, doing this particular thing. So there's always an idea of who had access at what point in time they did as well. And the physical security of voting machines is led by, there's like a team of people that's bipartisan in nature. So Republicans and Democrats are basically both working on the physical security of the machines. Now, also, there's backups in case the numbers fail in a lot of the machines. And that does include paper ballots. Paper ballots can sometimes in states be used as a backup, but not always. And finally, on this particular section, there is an incentive to have people not basically commit fraud in any way by making it a crime. And often it's a felony, which is obviously more serious than a misdemeanor. So that's trying to incentivize people not to go down that road. Now, election 2020 is unique. We all have a sense of this with COVID-19. It's not only about securing the machines, it's securing the voter, okay? And one of the ways we have a sense of this is all the early voting happening. As of October 30th, 2020, over 85 million early votes had been cast. 30 million in person, 55 million, a million, with 35 million still outstanding. To compare, in 2016, there was only overall a total of 58 million early votes. That's a huge difference this year. Partially because of COVID, maybe partially because of the interest in this election that people are doing it early. Now, when I say securing the voter, makes us talk about what's happening at the polls because of COVID-19. What precautions are there to protect people? Well, the mask wearing is either required or heavily sort of suggested. There's social distancing between people when they line up at the polls. There's screening of staff at polling places for the virus. And there's lots of hand sanitizer and cleaning of machines. I can say that with some expertise because recently I did vote at a polling place in Utah, and everyone was masked up. You had to stand 6 feet behind a person, and there was a lot of cleaning going on and sanitizer everywhere. Now, just because fraud is not common doesn't mean it does not get politicized. It doesn't mean it's not an issue to take somewhat seriously, but it still gets politicized even beyond its actual need. And have just a small example, a few examples, I should say, to show that. So if we want to generalize, there's been a lot of court cases that revolve around either loosening or tightening of the voting rules around election 2020, because nominally it is worrying about election security and integrity. The generalization is, which holds true pretty much in every single court case, is the Democratic Party has tried to loosen the voting rules, make it a little easier to vote. The Republican Party has tried to tighten the rules. And the courts have gotten involved. And I have some examples of states having cases and then going all the way up to the Supreme Court to rule on them. Now, the Supreme Court may, depending on the specifics, where I'm not going to get into, loosen or tighten, but the parties have their particular stances. So some examples. In Wisconsin, there was a case decided by the Supreme Court on October 27th that absentee ballots can't be counted up to 6 days after the election. Pennsylvania on October 20th, the Supreme Court left an extension for absentee ballots to be counted up to 3 days after the election if they postmark it by election day. October 29th in North Carolina, the Supreme Court allowed an extension to count absentee ballots until November 12th if postmarked by election day. In Alabama, the ruling by the Supreme Court was on October 22nd, allowing Alabama to reinstate a ban on curbside voting. A lower court had undone this ban and they reversed it. And sometime in October in South Carolina, the Supreme Court sided with state Republicans, saying that absentee ballots must be signed by a witness. Rhode Island, they did the opposite because of the dynamics of that particular case, allowing the banning of the requirement for having to get a witness on absentee ballots. And in June, finally in Texas, Supreme Court turned down a request of Democrats to allow, quote, any eligible voters to apply for, receive, and cast an absentee ballot during the coronavirus pandemic. What does all this say? That there's a lot of contestation about what the pre-election situation and election day setup should look like and how easy or a little bit harder it should be for people to be able to vote. And nominally, now again, we have to remember a lot of this is political, but nominally it is about the concerns over election integrity and security. So at this point, I will pass off to my colleague what happens on voting day and beyond.
All right, yeah, Colin was talking very much about the popular vote, the processes, the integration, and some of the issues when it comes to the popular vote. But after the election day, we have another sort of an additional process of the election process, and that is known as the electoral vote process, which occurs in the post-election context. To better understand that post-election process and how the president and vice president of the United States is elected, we really need to kind of unpack this institution of electoral college. which votes on the President of the United States. An electoral college is a group of electors that is required by the Constitution of the United States to be formed every 4 years. So every election cycle, presidential election cycle, this group of electors is formed in order to vote for the President and Vice President of the United States. Now, how is the Electoral College made up? You know, how do they vote? Who allocates them? Which state gets more electoral votes than other states, and so on and so. So Electoral College has a total of 538 votes as of right now. So the President of the United States has to win the majority of those votes in order to be declared the President of the United States. So you need at least 270 of these votes to win the presidency. And the way that these electoral votes are allocated are based on congressional delegation or population, that is how population is distributed and how, or you know, how each state or how many seats each state gets to have in Congress. So for example, Utah has 6 congressional seats, 2 senator and 4 House of Representative seats. So that's total of 4 congressional seats, which equals 4 electoral votes. California, for example, has 55 electoral votes, and Texas has 38 electoral votes, and Florida has 22 electoral votes, and Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, and so on and so. So these votes are important because the more votes you collect, the closer you are to a victory. So presidential candidates during the election, they focus largely on the states that they, you know, that states that can bring the most electoral votes to them. And speaking of electoral college, we also have some states that are solid Republican or solid Democrat states, and presidential candidates don't normally focus a lot of campaigning on those states because they are pretty sure these states will go for them. Most of the competition for electoral votes and popular votes, for that matter, happen in what we call battleground states, or states that are up for grabs. And this election cycle, we have states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, are some of the most contested and the most battleground states, if you will, during this election cycle. So at the end of the day, electoral college is important because in addition to the popular vote, we also have electoral college, which votes usually a couple of weeks after the election day for the President and Vice President of the United States. So now that we know that we have 538 electoral votes and 538 electors, how are these electors chosen? Like Colin was emphasizing, most of the election process is actually, at the level of the state. So electorals are also chosen at the state level. So state legislatures basically have the power to choose and appoint their own electors. And each state legislature determines the appointment process in terms of how they should vote, how they should, in terms of what kinds of offices or what kinds of positions they can and cannot have before they become electors. One of the offices that they cannot hold is a federal office. So those holding a federal office, either appointed or elected, cannot be nominated or appointed for electors representing the state. So let's go to the next slide. How do electors vote once they are picked from the state and state legislature? Generally speaking, across the states, even though the processes to elect them or appoint them are different, almost across all states, electors are supposed to reflect the popular vote on that state, meaning that they pledge under the state law that electoral votes will go for the candidate that got the most popular vote on that state. Now, does that always happen? Most of the time it does, but not always. We have also cases in which, we have cases, for example, in 2016, we had what we call faithless electors, meaning that they pledge under the state law that they will vote for the candidate that got the most popular vote on that state. However, at the end of the day, they change their position and they vote for either the opposing candidate or some third candidate. So this has happened in 2016. This has happened before 2016, and it might happen again. But generally speaking, state electors or electors representing the state will reflect the popular vote on that state, meaning as a group. So for example, if even though Pennsylvania might be a tightly contested state, if let's say Donald Trump wins most of the popular vote, then the electors, the 20 electors from Pennsylvania, they should reflect that popular vote in the electoral voting. Now, when it comes to electoral votes, as I said, most of the electors should reflect the popular vote because we have a process called winner take all. So whoever wins the popular vote, then the electoral vote should reflect that. And usually, almost across all states, at least 48 of them have a law or a mandate that requires that electors all should reflect, so uniformly vote to reflect the popular will. However, we have two states, Nebraska and Maine, which have what we call a split electoral vote, meaning that they can actually split their votes if electors decide to do so. Nebraska did that in 2008, and Maine did that in 2016. But for the most part, the rest of 48 states have to maintain what we call a concert behavior. They all have to vote in concert uniformly. So this is very much about electoral voting. So let's go into the next slide and look at some of the challenges to counting votes. As Colin has mentioned already, we are seeing record number of turnouts. I was just watching the news a couple of hours before I came online here, and more than 98 million Americans have already voted. And this is a very, very big numbers in terms of early voting. And a lot of voters are seeing these elections as very high stake elections. Either, from one side or the other, they believe that this is probably one of the most important elections of our at least lifetime. So what does this mean and who does it help? Depending on the perspective you take, depending on where you're looking at from. But generally speaking, the larger the turnout, the better for democracy, because we know democracy relies on a fair and free election process. It relies on, large voter turnout. The more voters turn out, the better our democracy is. We have also, Colin kind of talked quite a bit about the mail-in balloting and how, this historical rates of mail-in ballots have already, exceeded our expectations. And Colin also covered the COVID context. Is this because of the COVID? Is this because of very, very high stake elections, as many are calling? Regardless of what it is, as I said, I want to emphasize again, this is very important for democracy. And probably another thing that we have to watch for as, tomorrow night is approaching. This is very likely to turn into an election week rather than election night. I think, some states have already adjusted or created some new laws because of the COVID, because of the high numbers, to try to capture various contexts as better as possible, as much as possible. So it looks like this is more likely to be an election week, meaning that we might actually go on for the next couple of days into the weekend until we have a very clear sort of count of not only popular, but also electoral votes as well.
And I want to add one more thing, just based on what Perparim just talked about. It is telling how many people were voting early, because my statistic I had on my part of the presentation had 85 million people roughly. Perparim just said he watched the news a few hours ago, 98 million. That means in 3 days, we had 13 million more people vote. Very telling. I found that very interesting when you brought up that number.
Yeah.
I wanted to just point that out to everyone watching.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I just last night, it was 92 million when I looked at, and we have an extra 6 million in less than 24 hours. So it's very telling, very positive development. I think this is great for democracy because, you know, I always say the biggest pillar of democracy is representation, representativeness, which involves the election, the ability of people to have free and fair elections, the ability of people to go and vote and cast their vote for their preferred representative. So it's very important.
Well, I think that might wrap it up, Sean. If you have any last thoughts, prepare them, I don't know. But if you want to tidy it up, you want to ask us any questions, or do we want to?
Yeah, maybe in the event that neither candidate hits the 270 mark, do you want to talk a little bit about what that would look like?
I can, or I know Perparim can too. I don't. It doesn't matter who.
Go ahead, Colin. Yeah, yes, sure.
Well, it's an interesting process for those watching. They might not know that if nobody gets 50% or over 50% technically of the Electoral College, no one is declared the winner. And what happens? And it did happen in the election of 1824, that the House of Representatives determines who will win. But it's very interesting because every state delegation, no matter how large or small, gets one vote total. So 55 of the representatives in Congress and the House and Senate get collectively one vote. And then North Dakota, which is one representative and 2 senators, get one vote. So each state delegation gets one vote, and then they would determine who would be the president based on those state delegation votes. It's quite interesting. It's happened only one time in American history where it mattered in the election in 1824. I mean, anyone wants to go look that up? It's fascinating. You could do a deep dive, lots of YouTube videos, I'm sure.
Yeah. And, you know, another, since college, I mean, Electoral College, usually it's kind of a mystery to many of our students. They are not aware of how does it really work? Why is it there? Should we get rid of it? Is it a positive institution? Is it a negative? Does it impact our democracy? How does it? I think it's an important checks and balance within that context of checks and balances. I think it's an important institution because it gives voice to the states, like Colin was mentioning South Dakota versus California. So California has 55 votes, South Dakota has 3 Electoral College votes, but yet if it comes down to a tie, then they really have the same voice in the election of the President and Vice President of the United States. So we have to understand that this institution was placed just as another checks and balances within the constitutional order of the United States. So, you know, while you might agree or disagree whether we should keep it or not have it, I think it's a healthy institution to keep the balance between the urban centers and the more rural areas and the states within the United States of America.
Maybe last question, where do the two of you go for, where will you be watching election coverage? I just thought of that when I was contemplating myself where the, you know, where I'm comfortable.
Yeah, I have set on my TV 960, channel number 965 CNN and channel number 966 Fox. So basically I'll just go up and down, up and down. I usually prefer to watch a variety of coverages or sources, or, you know, so I prefer to have at least more than 2, but I definitely will watch international coverage as well, because there has been a lot of international interest on those elections as well. As you know, America is very much, you know, involved in international politics, and certain countries around the world want to see certain outcomes. So I've been very much following international news as well, just to see how, you know, how everything plays out internationally and globally. So.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. I'm going to be doing that too. I'm going to be reading up, especially on different perspectives around the world. Where I'll watch the election, well, COVID has been driving me to my couch these days with all the online classes I'm teaching. So I'll be probably right on my couch watching the election results as they come in. And my TV package limits me. So I will be, because of Sling TV's inability to offer me more services, CNN, and then I will go to live TV sometimes for ABC, NBC, and CBS just to check out some differences. But it'll definitely be an exciting night, regardless of the fact that I will be in the same place I have been quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, I know our Student Media Center in the Globe is going to be running some election coverage, so I'll put that plug in for listeners. And thanks to both of you for taking the time this evening. We'll get this posted and circulated. I really appreciate you both sharing your expertise and hopefully providing a little more insight into how the election can unfold.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having us. Our pleasure. It was great.